What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today I'm going to be sharing what I consider to be the best controller settings for the Battlefield 6 beta, or at least the best settings that worked for me, and more importantly, in this game, you'll find very quickly the settings are very complex and often very vaguely described as well, and you'll see a very wide range of recommendations depending on people's preferences, so for many, it can be very overwhelming and confusing trying to get your controller settings dialed in. And this is why I'm not just going to be sharing my settings and getting you to copy and paste them, even though I will be sharing them. Instead, my goal here with this video is to properly explain what these settings actually do, so you can make more informed decisions when you make your own adjustments, which I always recommend doing. I think copying settings from someone like myself can definitely give you a much better starting point to build off of compared to the horrible default settings in this game, but I strongly suggest you take the time to fine-tune things from there. Now, right up front, my preference is more of a snappier feel with the ability to turn around quite quickly if somebody ends up behind me, for instance, without sacrificing control when aiming down sight. The settings that I've landed on feel very close to Call of Duty, and I've actually done the math on this as well, and I've got them dialed in pretty close to what you'd experience in Call of Duty, which I know many of you guys will be looking for. But at the end of the day, this all does come down to preference. Maybe the settings I've landed on that feel more like Call of Duty won't be the settings that you like, and that's totally fine. There are plenty of other people providing different approaches, and a different approach might work better for you, or this might be right up your alley. And with that out of the way, let's dive right into this, and I want to first start this off with the non-controller settings that I would still highly recommend taking a look at and making some adjustments to, just because it'll make the gameplay experience that much better. If we started off in the accessibility tab and scroll down to our camera effects, you want to turn all of these all the way down or all the way off, at least in my opinion. For the most part, these settings are designed to make things look cinematic, but in doing so, you often lose out on vital information with the actual gameplay experience. And this is why I always turn all of these sorts of settings all the way off or all the way down, and I'd recommend you do the same. Then when it comes to gameplay settings, I didn't really adjust anything in here that I can't also adjust in the controller settings, so we're actually going to skip over gameplay settings and dive right into the controller settings here. And the first thing is my button layout. I like using a tactical layout in Call of Duty. They call that an alternate layout in Battlefield. And what this does is it just swaps your crouch or slide button with your melee button. So you're going to be crouching and sliding with R3 rather than circle. And I just find that gives you more control over your movement without having to take your thumb off of your aiming analog stick. Next, something I notice is when you set this, it actually doesn't let you slide by using the R3 button right away. So with this, you want to go to Edit Presets, Edit Button Mapping, and then you'll have to scroll down to the slide button and manually map this. It will say it's overwriting something. That's totally fine as long as slide as well as crouch and prone are attached to the R3 as well. That will give you that tactical layout feel from Call of Duty. And while we're here in this button mapping, something else I'd recommend switching from the default alternate settings is your ping button, which is incredibly useful in Battlefield. You definitely want to be using your ping button as much as possible to mark enemies and tanks and positions. And by default, it's mapped to L1, which is really awkward if you're aiming down sight using L2. So I actually like switching this over to R1, and then that will overwrite your grenade throw, which is R1 by default. So then I just make sure I manually map that one to L1. So I do swap those two around. Then we want to go into edit settings here. And something I haven't mentioned yet, we're just focusing on infantry settings today. Those are the most important, in my opinion, at least. I might go deeper into vehicle settings and stuff like after launch, but for now, just infantry settings. And we're going to modify here. And right at the top of the list, we have our infantry aim sensitivity. This is your base default sensitivity that most of the settings from here on out will be based on. And for me, I like going fairly high here. This scale is very different from Call of Duty scale, even at a 70 sensitivity, which is fairly high in this game. That's going to be a little bit slower than what you'd experience with a more low or moderate sensitivity. Keep in mind, in Black Ops 6, for instance, I like a 1.65 sensitivity, which is, again, a moderate sensitivity, but in this game, I like 70, which is a little on the higher side, and this allows you to spin around reasonably quickly in those situations where somebody suddenly sneaks up behind you, for instance. Obviously, this one is going to be highly preference-based, so absolutely tune from there. But I would say don't be afraid to get a little bit higher up with this value. We'll make adjustments for fine control as we go. Then when it comes to field of view, I like 105. This is just a nice sweet spot for me, so that's where I like to keep that. And next, let's talk about uniform infantry aiming, or uniform soldier aiming is what they call it in Battlefield 2042. This is one of the most confusing settings here, especially for Call of Duty players, because Call of Duty doesn't have a setting like this at all. And without this setting, or if you turn this setting off, the higher the zoom level of your optic, the slower your aim is going to feel, assuming all else is equal and you haven't adjusted any like per zoom multipliers or anything like that. And that means if you have a red dot and you try to do a 360, you're going to be doing that 360 so much faster than a sniper scope, like a 6x sniper optic, for instance. That's going to be painfully slow relative to a red dot. And what this means is without this setting, you'll often find that your sensitivity feels really good with a red dot sight, but then the moment you try to snipe, now your aim is moving so slow left to right that you can't even track targets that are running perpendicular to you, even though you'd have no problem doing that if you're using the red dot sight. And in order to fix this in Call of Duty, you'd have to go through each zoom sensitivity multiplier and adjust those manually. And that gives you that level of control, but uniform aiming is designed to solve this issue by making that automatic adjustment to your sensitivity based on the zoom level. So it's doing the math for you here. And the higher you go with this value, the more relative boost you get with a higher sensitivity value. So a really high value means that when you use a sniper optic relative to a red dot, it's going to feel a lot faster than if you had a very low value with this zoom sensitivity coefficient. Now, the default coefficient is set to 133. This was based off of Counter-Strike from way back in the day, since I believe they introduced this feature for the first time, and that's back when a lot of people are using a 4x3 display, and 4 divided by 3 will give you roughly 133. So what I've seen a lot of people recommend is to adjust this to account for a 16:9 ratio, which is the aspect ratio that almost everybody is playing on these days. And in order to get that value, 16/9 gives you 177.7 repeating, or 177.8. So if you want that perfectly adjusted to your aspect ratio, that's the value you want to go with. But I've seen a lot of people state this as if there's a right or wrong answer, and you absolutely must put it on this value if you're on a 16:9 monitor, and that couldn't be further from the truth. This is absolutely a value you should adjust based on your own preferences. And while it's a good starting point to work off of, if you find that your aim feels really good with a red dot sight, but then you try to snipe and you still feel like your aim sensitivity is just a bit too slow and you can't track targets with a sniper rifle very well, then feel free to bump this value up. It'll increase that relative sensitivity value for you, and that may feel way better. Or on the flip side of that, if you find that red dot aiming feels good, but then sniping with a 6x feels way too fast and you just feel like you don't have enough control with that, then drop this value. There's nothing wrong with making those adjustments. This isn't a set in stone value, but it'll give you a good place to work from. Now, in saying all of this, I wanted to make sure I explain properly what this uniform infantry aiming does, since it is one of the big questions that people have when looking at these sensitivity values. At the end of the day, funny enough, I turn this off. I come from Call of Duty where we don't have access to this. My muscle memory is based around Call of Duty, and I'm assuming for many of you watching this video, it will be the same. And therefore, I like making the fine adjustments for myself rather than having this system try to do that for me. And we'll get much deeper into those adjustments in just a little bit. Next, let's talk about aim assist a little bit. And first off, we have just infantry aim assist. And this is essentially your rotational aim assist that you would see in Call of Duty, although not quite as strong. I'd recommend just keeping this at 100. Then when it comes to our aim assist slowdown, same thing as aim assist slowdown in Call of Duty. So as you sweep your aim across a target, it will effectively slow your sensitivity as you're sweeping across that bubble. And then we have zoom snapping, which is something that Call of Duty multiplayer doesn't have and has never had. However, you will see it featured in Zombies and Campaign for Call of Duty. But with this, the way it works is if you aim down sight close to but not on an enemy player, this will snap to that enemy player for you. And the higher the value, the stronger that snap is going to be. And I'm personally not a big fan of this, at least not at 100. I find that snaps a little bit too harshly. It really grabs my aim, and I often find that I end up fighting this a bit too much. So initially I did start with this completely off, but I have since adjusted that a little bit. I brought it back up to 30. 30 gives you that little bit of a helping hand to get you on target, but it's not nearly as aggressive as if you have this maxed out. Obviously, this does come down to preference. Some of you guys want this to snap super hard to target, and that's totally fine. But for me, 30 seems to be a good place. Then after that, let's have a look at our aiming input curves. And we have various options, but they just state what they were in older Battlefield games, which obviously isn't helpful if you haven't played the older Battlefield games. However, Battlefield 2042, in their settings, they have a lot of the same settings here, and they show us what these curves look like. So here they are. And for the most part, they're all very similar. They're all exponential curves aside from linear, meaning that when you move your stick a little bit, your aim moves a little bit. And as you increase, it doesn't increase how much your aim is moving linearly, it will accelerate the more you deflect your stick. Now, the exponential curve is what you would see with the standard response curve in Call of Duty. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like they have anything that replicates the dynamic response curve or a reverse S curve. So if you use dynamic in COD, you're kind of out of luck on this one. What I found here is if I just leave these on standard, I can make adjustments for myself that makes this feel a bit more like dynamic, a little bit more snappy. So that's where I've landed with these. Realistically, even if you make adjustments, they're going to be very subtle adjustments for most of them. And now let's get into aiming left-right acceleration. This one is a bit confusing and kind of counterintuitive. And what this means is the higher your acceleration value, the slower your acceleration is going to be. The longer it's going to take for your sensitivity to ramp up as you're turning. Whereas the lower you go with this, the snappier things are going to feel, but that'll also give you the feeling of a bit less control if you're just trying to make really fine adjustments. And for me, what I've found for a nice snappy feel that doesn't sacrifice that fine control is 60. 60 feels like the sweet spot in my eyes. If that feels a little too snappy and you want a bit more control, increase that value a bit. If it doesn't feel snappy enough, reduce that value a little bit and go from there. But I wouldn't recommend going too far off this value unless it just really feels good to you. Now after that, we'll scroll all the way down here to our vertical aim ratio. And we also have vertical zoom ratio if you have uniform aiming turned off. And with this is basically the ratio between your vertical and horizontal sensitivity values. And once again, this does depend on the aspect ratio of the monitor that you're using. Again, the vast majority of you will be using a 16:9 monitor, meaning the math on this is 9/16, which gives you 56.25, or we'll round up here to 56.3. And that will give you a consistent sensitivity value between vertical and horizontal sensitivity. So in Call of Duty, for instance, if you set your vertical and horizontal values exactly the same all the time, then this is the value I'd recommend going with. However, for many people, they tend to like having a slower vertical sensitivity value compared to horizontal due to the fact that you rarely need to sweep your aim up and down as often or as quickly as you would have to with left or right. And therefore, it's totally fine to go lower than this value. But I would say, while it is preference-based at the end of the day, it would be very strange to go above this value. Now, after that, we have our infantry zoom aim sensitivity value. So when you aim down sight, regardless of the optic you're using, how much is this going to be reducing your sensitivity? Keeping in mind, even if you have this set at 100, there will be a reduction, but I like setting this down to 80 for a further reduction there. That means, again, I can have a fairly high sensitivity and turn quickly when hip firing, but the moment I aim down sights, now it really slows my sensitivity and gives me that fine control. And 80 felt like a good start, but then I take things further with my individual zoom aim sensitivity values. But before we get into that, we do have our zoom transition sensitivity smoothing value. And if you have this off, that means the moment you start aiming down sight, you get your aim down sight sensitivity. If you have it on, it will gradually reduce your sensitivity from your hip fire sensitivity to your aim down sight sensitivity while you're in the process of aiming down sight, which I think for most people, that's what they're comfortable with. Also, if you are using uniform aiming, it will automatically gradually do that. You don't have the option to turn this off. But for me, I do keep this one on. And now let's talk about our individual zoom aim sensitivity values. And this is how I like to set it up. For anything from a 1x to a 2x zoom, I go with a 75. And keep in mind, this also works on top of the infantry aim zoom sensitivity. But what I found is combining 80 with 75 with a red dot, that will give you roughly the same ratio that you would experience with a 0.75 ADS multiplier in Call of Duty, which is what I use, as the default slowdown isn't quite as harsh as what you experience by default in Call of Duty here. So that's why I like the combination of those values, and that's what works best for me up until a 3x zoom. And at that point, I just want to increase it slightly so I have a little more control there. And then the moment I get up above a 5x zoom, when I'm looking at like sniper scopes, this is where I increase this value, because if I have this less than 100 or at 100, then I often find that I can't track those targets that are moving perpendicular, which again is a downside of not having that universal aim setting on, but this is why we just adjust that manually. This now gives me the ability to make those quicker tracking movements with a sniper rifle without completely losing out on precision. Obviously, you can adjust it even more to your liking, and it's what I'm comfortable with in Call of Duty, and therefore that's what I'm comfortable with in Battlefield. I've done a lot of testing with this, and it feels just right for me. Now, outside of that, I just keep all of these values exactly the same. And then getting back into the controller scheme setting, you definitely want to scroll all the way to the bottom. I can't believe they kept this hitting toward the bottom, because these are some of the most important stats to pay attention to here. With this, I turn vibration off. It's a preference thing, but I just find the vibrations to be an unnecessary distraction. They don't really do anything for me that audio doesn't already do, so I just keep those off. Then when it comes to our left stick or our movement stick values, for my dead zone, I dropped that down to a 2, and my axial dead zone, I set that to a 10 for my left stick. And I'll explain axial dead zone a little bit when we talk about the right stick more. As for our max input threshold, for the movement stick, I like dropping this a little bit, just because it feels a bit more responsive then for movement. I don't have to deflect my stick all the way to get technically maximum deflection. And when it comes to movement, usually you just want maximum deflection. And therefore, we get to that maximum deflection a little bit faster when we lower this value, so I just dropped it down to 80. Now let's talk about right stick, which is our aiming stick. This one is more important. Our center dead zone, once again, I set that at 2. It does depend on how much stick drift you may or may not have on your controller, but for me, 2 works well. And our axial dead zone here, I set at 8. And just to explain what the axial dead zone is for anybody that's unfamiliar, this essentially determines how much you lock yourself into either straight vertical or straight horizontal aiming when sweeping your aim left or right or up or down. If you have a very high value for your axial dead zone and you try to do a 360, for instance, this will keep you essentially perfectly locked on a horizontal plane. There will be no up or down movement whatsoever with your aim. Whereas when you set this value really low, you'll find that even if you try to keep that perfect horizontal plane to do a 360, your aim is going to be drifting upward or downward with any slight deflection with your stick. And in my opinion, going too high or too low with this value can feel really bad, because many times you want to make that perfect horizontal or perfect vertical movement, and that's just not going to be possible if the value is set too low. But at the same time, if you go too high, it feels like you're really restricted and locked, and it can kind of feel like the controller is fighting you when you're trying to make some fine adjustments. So this is why I would generally recommend falling somewhere between the 5 to 15 range on this. That's probably going to be the range that works best for the vast majority of players out there. Like I said, for me, I like an 8, but anywhere in that range should be good for you. And there we go. Those are the controller settings that I found work best for me and feel the most like Call of Duty. And I found a lot of success with this in Battlefield 2042 when playing around with this. And then obviously I did a bunch of testing this morning with the beta to make sure that it still feels good in Battlefield 6, and it does. Next, I want to talk about some graphics settings. Keeping in mind, I'm on PlayStation 5. These settings will vary, especially if you're on PC. You're going to have access to far more settings. But I like having our performance preset set to performance. Brightness and sharpness, obviously you want to just adjust those based on your display. Field of view, again, I use 105. I turn all these settings off. We already talked about all of these ones here, I believe, but definitely turn them off or as low as possible. My weapon field of view, by the way, I like using wide for that as well. So the weapon will display a little bit smaller on the screen, so it's less obstructive. Then for interface and HUD, I just turned off soldier and vehicle HUD motion. I don't like having my heads-up display shaking around. I like it to be nice and static. Then for audio, this one's going to depend on your audio setup. I use headphones with high dynamics. For music volume, I just turn this off because I'm often just sitting in menus to record videos and I don't like hearing the music over and over again. I like turning the commander voiceover volume down a little bit just so it doesn't get in the way of any really important gameplay audio as it's happening. And that's pretty much it when it comes to audio settings that are important. As for system settings, let's get into the minimap settings, which I find are quite important. The first thing that Call of Duty players especially will probably want to turn on is your view rotation. If it's not already on, you probably want that on, so the minimap will rotate with your character. Next up, my close minimap view distance, I like increasing that up to 60. I just find the default value is a little too narrow, and therefore you're missing out on a lot of very valuable information. Obviously, you can also adjust that to medium and far well in the gameplay. Then getting back into the system settings here, I would recommend turning scoreboard ping on and also the network graph. I definitely like having the network performance bar always on so I can see what my ping is and all of the important network stats so I can see if there is an issue and there's a reason my shots aren't registering, for instance, if they aren't registering. And there we go. That is going to wrap it up for today's video on the best settings that I've found so far for Battlefield 6. Now, at the end of the day, there's a chance that I still might make some minor adjustments to this. And if I do, I will leave a pinned comment. Also, I'll probably be making an updated version of this video when the full launch of the game happens. But this should at least get you started with your Battlefield 6 beta settings. And this is where I'm curious to hear from you guys in those comments down below. For those of you guys that have tried these settings that I've shared, how does it feel for you? Does it feel significantly better than the base settings? Do you like using that uniform infantry aiming or not? Just let me know all of those thoughts down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.